Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Jacob Shapiro, partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Alex Finch. She is an associate at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law and an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Her work and scholarship focuses on global health governance, law, and policy. And I found Alex because she co-wrote an excellent op-ed in the New York Times, and I emailed her out of the blue, and she said she'd be willing to come on and talk about not Mpox itself, but rather the global legal response and legal frameworks that exist to respond not just to Mpox, but to global pandemics in general. It was a fascinating conversation. I think Alex will be a guest on future episodes if I didn't scare her off too much, but I learned a lot, and I hope that you will learn a lot as well. Apologies if the cadence of the podcast has been a little bit off. Rob has been on vacation for a couple weeks. I'm actually out myself next week and then doing some work-related travel. So we are still trying to get you at least one episode a week. And hopefully by mid-September, our cadence will be back to normal. In the meantime, if you need anything or want to talk about anything that you've heard on the podcast, you can always email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode. Take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. Alex, thank you for joining an illustrious list of people who get cold emails from me to come on the podcast, not knowing who I am or what this is. I appreciate your bravery.
Yeah, happy to be here. It's really lovely to meet you.
So we will have links to all of the different articles that we're actually going to talk about in this podcast on the show notes. So if you want to see the op-ed that Alex co-wrote in the New York Times or some of the articles that she's referring to, we will have all those links in the show notes. Alex, I'm a little conflicted with where to begin here because there's an Mpox story, which maybe can lead into some broader, conversations about the World Health Organization and how the world thinks about pandemics. But then there's also an argument to start from the top down. So those will be the two places that we try and start our conversation. I think an interesting place maybe to start and to try and square the difference is that, the World Health Organization recently declared Mpox a global health emergency. The Africa CDC has declared it. I forget what the exact terminology is. I'm sure you'll tell us. But at the same time, they did this in 2022 as well. And it's not like monkeypox and Mpox is new. Is that a sign of failure? Is it a sign of success that we're having more emergency declarations as new things pop up? Talk to me about, at least to frame the conversation about whether Mpox so far is a success story or a story that tells us just how woefully underprepared we actually are.
Okay. I think for the first point, it indicates that, diseases are, particularly emerging and re-emerging diseases, are going to pose, a continuing problem for global health security. We're sort of living an age of pandemics at the moment with, this is the third declaration that the WHO has made in the past 3 years. We had COVID and then 2 successive declarations for Mpox emergency. So I think, if anything, it's an indication that this is a really present and ongoing concern for global health security. But in terms of the declarations themselves, this one in particular, so the WHO's recent Public Health Emergency of International Concern declaration, I think was a good decision, mainly because it moved relatively quickly. So WHO in the past, I'm thinking for the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and then again at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, was not as quick on its feet as it could have been in making these declarations. And what's significant about them is that it sort of sets in motion obligations under this treaty, the international health regulations, for countries to sort of kick into gear and stop outbreaks before they sort of spiral out of control into pandemic level territory. And that includes things from, providing information to WHO about, how this disease is really spreading in the community and cases. It means that the Director General can start issuing recommendations to countries about, how they should be responding to this, including how not to implement restrictions like travel restrictions that really impact the response on the ground, but also sort of getting countries to start cooperating, including, sending money, sending human resources over to really stop the outbreak. So I think the fact that there has been a declaration recently should be measured as a good thing. And that it's happening at the same time as Africa CDC's own declaration is also probably a good thing, because this one, as I mentioned before, or I haven't mentioned this before, it's called a public health emergency of continental security, the Africa CDC one. And that's that's the first time that Africa CDC has actually made a declaration of this sort using its own emergency powers. And it kind of does a similar thing to the WHO's declaration, but just within the African continent. It means that member states in the African Union can start coordinating the response. It unlocks a bunch of funding, and it means that, countries within the union are, on high alert to start doing better testing for this thing. So I hope that answers your question.
No,
about
it gets us as a start. One question I already have is, so you mentioned the first time that the Africa CDC has done this. Is that because this is a new mechanism for them? Because obviously they've had diseases in recent history that it seems would have qualified for this sort of thing. So why is this the first time?
I think it's the first time largely because it's a relatively new power under the statute. And but it's also the first kind of continental security event that's really risen to this level. So these powers, I don't think were around, and you can fact check this, but I don't think they were around at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014. So it's a relatively new agency, and it has been cooperating a lot more with WHO, including WHO's regional office of the African region and also country offices now. So it is a new thing. It's the first time this declaration has been in effect. And so it's a bit of a wait and see to see, how effective it is in generating the sort of cooperation we need within the region.
Well, yeah. And that leads right into sort of maybe the crux of all of these sorts of issues. And you sort of already alluded to it, which is power, and where it comes into where we talk about politics. Because, in your article in the New England Journal of Medicine, for instance, you talk about how the WHO has recently released 1.45 million in the context of the Mpox declaration. That's great, but that's 1.45 million. Like that's pennies on the dollar in terms of like what's happening here. And you also talk about how the U.S. offered 50,000 vaccine doses. The EU via Denmark has offered another 200,000. Again, that pales in comparison to the scope of the problem. And my understanding is that even in 2022, when the first Mpox declaration was made, like very few, if any, vaccines actually made their way into Africa at all, even though there were some promises of moving things there, but vaccines didn't actually get there. In one of your articles, I highlighted this quote that when in the context of COVID-19, so not Mpox now, but COVID, by late 2021, high-income countries had vaccinated 75% of their populations, while we were talking about fewer than 2% in poorer countries had received a single dose. So I guess there's a two-part question there, which is, is it just going to, am I being unrealistic? It's going to take a while to get the machine rolling to get more funding and more vaccine doses. But the second part of the question is, who enforces some of these things? Like if the U.S. is not providing its vaccines, who is going to go tell the U.S., okay, get the vaccines here or there, and if not, there is a punishment that will force you to do that sort of thing? Or is it all just sort of, theoretical or agreements that aren't going to be enforced by any sort of body?
Okay, I'm going to ask you to remind me of that second question because I feel like I might be on the first one for a bit.
Great.
So yeah, that's a really good observation. I think when the WHO declared the previous public health emergency of international concern over for Mpox in 2023, that's even as cases of Mpox were on the rise in DRC. But this is a different clade of Mpox. We can talk about the differences between the clades a little bit more if you like, but it's a different subtype, a different clade that is actually a little bit more severe, but it's just transmitting in a different way than clade 2B, which was the clade that was responsible for the 2022-2023 outbreak. But that was in, the Americas and the EU, and it was mainly among men who have sex with men. And that outbreak came under control largely because of vaccination, but also because of, quite significant behavioral change, really, really good messaging on how to stop transmission. But we saw that, when that declaration ended, there was a sort of a lag in vaccine approval. In other contexts, people weren't testing new drugs. So the drug that was used, the antiviral that was used in the outbreak in the EU of Mpox clade 2B, the NIH has found that it doesn't work that well for clade 1B, so it actually can't be used in the current response in DRC and neighboring countries. But it also meant the end of this declaration meant that, endemic Mpox just wasn't prioritized at the level that it was. And the whole idea of a public health emergency declaration, at least at the international level, is to get countries to start coordinating with one another. So it's posed a number of challenges. In terms of the current challenges at the moment, one of the big ones is just surveillance and testing, because there hasn't been enough investment in these capabilities in the African region. It just means that cases are being missed. The Africa CDC Director General said that, testing capacities are around about as low as 18% in some countries. There's challenges transporting samples to actually get tested in laboratories in that context. And WHO has since, because of this declaration, asked manufacturers who make tests to start submitting them for emergency use listings so they can be delivered. I've talked about, the treatment problem. That's an ongoing challenge because we don't have treatments that work. You mentioned the financing piece, drop in the ocean, really. Africa CDC has launched a financing appeal. They think it's going to cost about $245 million, and they've got about 20 of that. WHO, like I mentioned in our article, has released some money from its contingency fund, but also a drop in the ocean compared to what it thinks it's going to need for the next 6 months, which is about $135 million. And that number doesn't include what it's going to cost to procure vaccines. So there is a massive difference between financing need and also what is available at the moment, what donors have been prepared to provide. And then the last issue, like you mentioned, is the vaccine problem. So because of the outbreak of Mpox clade 2b in the EU and the US, we have vaccines. It's not like at the beginning of COVID where, we're dealing with a completely unknown pathogen and it takes like a year to develop them. In this case, we do have vaccines that we know that work and they were available in the EU, in the US, but they just weren't given to Africa to actually build sufficient immunity before this outbreak started. There is some progress towards getting there. I know that there have been negotiations and pledges. Japan has pledged about 3 million of its own vaccine, which is approved for children, which is really, really good for at least one of the outbreaks that's going on. And then there's the one that's approved in the US and the EU, the Jynneos vaccine. There's negotiations at the moment between that manufacturer, Bavarian Nordic, and Africa CDC. But the Director General of Africa CDC thinks they're going to need 10 million doses to really stamp this out. DRC itself needs about 3.5 million. So we've got a real gap between need and supply.
So I have two questions there, and I'll start with the first one, which is who is making the determination about starting an emergency and when an emergency ends? Is that a body within the WHO? Are they appointed? How does that actually work?
It's a good question. So at the WHO, the ultimate authority actually just sits with the Director General. So under the international health regulations, there's a whole process that leads up to making this determination. And the Director General has to set up this emergency committee to provide advice on whether they think an outbreak actually arises to this level of emergency. And there's sort of generally just 3 criteria for that. One is that, it's an extraordinary event. Another is it constitutes a public health risk to other countries through the international spread of disease. And the third is that an international coordinated response is needed to stamp this thing out. And so that committee would advise the Director General, and they can say whatever they want. So interestingly, what happened with the Mpox declaration 2 years ago in 2022 is that the Director General didn't take the emergency committee's advice. The emergency committee was like, no, we don't think it's there yet, but primarily because of the communities impacted, really vulnerable communities of men who have sex with men, and the concerns about international spread and the fact that the virus was spreading in different ways, through sexual contact as opposed to other types of close contact. The Director General went ahead and declared it an emergency anyway. But in this case, we had alignment between the emergency committee and the Director General. Everybody agreed pretty quickly that, unanimously that all those criteria were met. And so they could move forward with a declaration which kind of kicks into motion all those activities I talked about before.
Yeah. Forgive me for what probably seem like simplistic questions for you, but I don't know the answers to them. So I have to ask them, and hopefully I'm being a good surrogate for the audience, which is, so how does the WHO Secretary General get chosen, and how do the members of that committee, that emergency committee that you talked about, get chosen or selected?
The Director General is elected. They're a sort of a diplomat that's the public face of the WHO, and the emergency committee is a group of experts that's selected from an existing list of experts.
And who's doing the selecting?
Yeah. You know what? I might have to get back to you on that one to work out, because it has to be representative. Well, there has to be, I think, at least two, and I can fact check this with the regulations a little later. But I think there have to be two representatives on that committee from the affected country. So I think that was set up to assuage any concerns by the affected country that their sovereignty was getting pushed to the side, essentially, because they're the communities that are experiencing an outbreak. So it is a community of experts that are selected, who are familiar with the regulations, who understand risks involved in diseases. But at the end of the day, it's the Director General who has the final word.
Well, and interesting that the Director General, as you say, is a diplomat who takes the advice of the committees, but maybe himself or herself is not necessarily the expert, but has to make the actual declaration.
Yeah. And in the past, because the decision-making isn't so transparent, what's really, really good about this declaration is that when WHO published its temporary recommendations, so the Director General, with making a declaration, is actually mandated to tell countries how they should respond. These are sort of temporary recommendations, which are not essentially non-binding advice to countries to say, here's how best to respond to this, but also, here's how you don't unduly impact, trade and travel to the affected countries to stop things like health workers getting there or vaccines and drugs getting there. But the idea with, all these other criteria have been considered in the past, where the considerations, the deliberations of the emergency committee just haven't been made public. This time they were published with the temporary recommendations, which is really good, because you saw the entire committee was generally aligned. They were actually properly considering the criteria. But, in the case of what brings to mind, Zika, when that emergency was declared in Latin America, there was a worry about, the Olympics in Rio at the time, acting as a sort of catalyst for more disease spread. There have been political considerations in the past that have, swung a determination either way. And there's nothing about, what are the political ramifications of this declaration that are in the regulations. So it's really good that, WHO's caught wind of the fact that we as the public kind of want to know the reasons for this, for their advice.
Yeah. Are there countries that are not members of the WHO that are not going to be in line to receive support like this? I'm thinking what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now brings up the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, obviously China versus Taiwan. Are there considerations there that also have to be worked in?
Yes, they were relevant issues, I think, during the COVID pandemic, because there haven't been any cases seeded there is a problem. But that doesn't mean that WHO doesn't have emergency responses in those contexts. So WHO is currently trying to mount a vaccination campaign against polio in the Gaza Strip, even though, Palestine is, I think it's an observer state. It's not a full member to the same extent that Israel is a full member.
Right. And the ongoing conflict in the Eastern DRC and Rwanda and everything that's going on there, I'm sure is part of what has made Mpox spread the way that it has. A second part of the question, though, that I wanted to ask there, based on what you said, was, we talked a little bit about how the WHO works. You were also talking about, we have vaccine doses, and you could theoretically, if you could get them in the right hands of the right people at the right time, maybe you could, at least slow this down considerably. But my question is, who pays for the vaccines? Does the WHO have its own funds that it can then pay manufacturers for the vaccines? Is this, when the United States offers to donate 50,000 vaccines, it's talking about purchasing them and the U.S. government and U.S. taxpayer is paying for them? What is the mechanics there?
There's a lot of different actors involved. So the WHO would be funding some of the response from its own core budget. some of this responsibility will lie with the DRC to purchase vaccines, but they've just said, this is a little bit too expensive, so we're going to need more donations or at least support to purchase. And then there are also procurement agencies like Gavi and UNICEF, who will probably be in negotiations with some of the manufacturers. I think WHO has recently sort of given the green light to Gavi and UNICEF to start negotiations with vaccines before it grants the emergency use listing to some of these vaccines, because the vaccines currently don't have official WHO approval at the moment. And that's really important for countries, particularly lower middle income countries that don't have their own regulatory capacities. They don't have an FDA, for example, or like a TGA. I'm Australian, so they don't have a TGA, but can do their own sort of regulatory approval. But currently, they've just got a recommendation to use it. So this whole process should speed up the availability of these sort of like unlicensed technologies. DRC, for example, I think has approved these technologies, but setting this whole process in motion for emergency use listing means that actors like Gavi and UNICEF can go ahead and start procuring these. And so there's some of the other actors that are involved. The international community should hopefully come together. We're going to see probably a mix of donations, just support to buy, but also potentially some technology transfer. So Africa CDC has said it's got manufacturers locally who could potentially produce this vaccine locally, which could support not just this outbreak of Mpox, but future outbreaks and get endemic disease under control if they're able to start making the vaccines locally without relying on these donations, without the pledges and all the kind of rigmarole that comes with being the party that's less powerful, essentially. And this kind of thing happened during the COVID pandemic, where the Serum Institute in India, for example, was able to produce some of the AstraZeneca vaccine at a much lower cost. And some of my colleagues had an article out recently, I can probably share the link with you, about the Serum Institute could potentially produce the Genius vaccine for like $4 or $5 rather than $110 per dose. But I think Africa CDC has currently asked for technology transfer from Bavarian Nordic, the company that makes the Genius vaccine, but they're in talks, but they're nowhere near close enough to actually transferring the technology.
I remember that was a big thing with COVID, because a lot of these countries were trying to manufacture the COVID vaccine in their own countries. And for instance, Moderna was talking about setting up a big facility in Kenya to manufacture COVID vaccines for the rest of the continent. I believe it was in April, they said they were shutting that down because there wasn't any need for it anymore. So I feel like technology transfer is always, that sounds great in principle, but when you actually get to the company transferring it, like, what is the incentive for a Danish company like that to actually give something to the DRC, which probably can't pay for it in any meaningful sense, right?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the incentive would just be knowledge that the technology is going to be used. This is endemic in Africa. It's been doing this for a while. You can't see this on a podcast.
But they get it.
Waves of endemic disease, which means there's probably like a public health need for this tool. And there are certainly, provided there are procurement agencies and WHO and partners involved, that there's at least a buyer. Africa CDC is also a sufficient buyer in this context. So I don't say that there's no incentive, but certainly the pharmaceutical industry through its associations have pretty staunchly opposed things like technology transfer in the pandemic agreement, for example, just because it limits the sort of incentives that they make that they have to make things like vaccines in that context. But this might be a different context. Potentially the manufacturer is a bit more open to technology transfer. I think because it's entering into these talks already, that's probably a good sign.
Well, and I guess it's also, Mpox is unique in this sense, in that it's an old disease that has been around for a while, and the vaccine is derived from a smallpox vaccine. It's not like you're giving away the secret mRNA code to how you created like the COVID vaccine so quickly. So maybe they're more willing to part with technology or intellectual property that has been around for a long time. I don't know. That's like rank speculation for me. Okay, I think that's a good segue though into thinking about because all of this sort of leads up to, wouldn't it be great to have a global pandemic treaty so that all these like responsibilities and powers were delineated and we knew all the answers to these questions. Um, so talk to me a little bit about the attempt to sign a global pandemic treaty and why it has not gotten across the finish line despite COVID and despite Mpox and the rising risk of more pandemics in the future.
Yeah, I feel like I can't talk about this without also talking about the international health regulations. So
Great.
I mentioned this before. This is the framework that supports the whole public health emergency of international concern declaration framework. It's a binding treaty. Every single member state of WHO, all 194 of them, plus 2 others, the Holy See and Liechtenstein, are parties to this treaty. And it's been around for a while, but it was significantly amended in 2005 to include a whole bunch of provisions that require states to, detect, assess, and report public health emergencies, but also a bunch of rules how to respond to public health emergencies. And for a while, these were tested by a bunch of outbreaks since 2005. There was an H1N1 outbreak, there was Ebola, there was Zika, and COVID-19 was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, where, the international community was like, oh, maybe these aren't, good enough to really protect countries around the world from health emergencies. For a number of reasons, I think there was not good enough implementation of them generally. They've got a whole bunch of obligations for countries to build up public health capacities, and there's a number of reasons for why they might not have done that. I think for low and middle income countries, it's just a resource ask. Building up surveillance laboratory capacities is expensive, but for others, probably limited political will. But there are also these other limitations with the IHR, so that we saw during the COVID pandemic. There was some delays in getting those early reports out of China to the WHO to actually understand what was going on. There was also a bit of back and forth that needed to happen between WHO and China just to get full and accurate information. There was a delay in reporting that this was actually human-to-human transmission. I think China was not forthcoming with a bit of that information. But then further down the track, some of the big failures was that WHO, through its Director General, in creating these temporary recommendations about how countries should respond to the pandemic, said, hey, don't implement unduly restrictive trade and travel restrictions. And basically every single country did that. There was this instance where South Africa reported the emergence of the Omicron variant. I don't know if you remember this, but and then uniformly all these countries around the world said, nobody's traveling to, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, all these countries in that region. And that just really hampered the response there and just punished these countries for reporting like they were required to do so. And there's also obligations under there to, for countries to, when they're implementing their response to public health emergencies, to do this, with respect for human rights. But, lots of countries violated human rights in their responses. So generally there was consensus in the international community that these rules, firstly, countries are not complying with them, but secondly, they just don't go far enough in everything they do about in relation to surveillance and response. They have no provisions in there at all that deals with what happens when you have a limited supply of countermeasures like vaccines and tests. And they're all sort of stacked and hoarded in high-income countries, and low-income countries just don't have access to them. So countries were particularly low and middle-income countries, and the African Union were we need a separate instrument that deals with equity and global pandemic response. So this is where these twin processes sort of set off from. Countries agreed that they wanted to amend the IHR, and they did that successfully on the 1st of June this year. At the very end of the World Health Assembly, there was a big rigmarole, and they ended up with some targeted amendments that had stuff in there about a new financing mechanism to support capacity building, a bunch of new obligations for WHO and countries to start trying to facilitate equitable access to products, and an implementation committee that was supposed to encourage cooperation and assistance between countries. But the pandemic agreement is sort of the big one. And the goal was to adopt it around about the same time in May this year. We just kind of sailed right through that deadline for a lot of reasons. I think negotiating, well, it's the same people who are negotiating these two instruments, right? Like, so, you know, they kind of recognized towards the end that, you know, we can adopt the IHR and we can keep working on the pandemic agreement. And there was a bit of confusion about what goes in what instrument. You know, there's going to be a bit of overlap because they kind of deal with the same stuff. And so they're ongoing. The aim at the moment is to try and adopt something by the end of the year. They've said some date in halfway through November, they're going to say, yes, we can make it, or no, we can't. We're going to try and adopt it at the May Health Assembly next year. But there is pretty strong consensus that this agreement is needed. And at least in my view, this current Mpox outbreak is just, it's so obvious that this kind of agreement is needed because we've got exactly the same problem where you've got all of these resources in high-income countries, and the second a declaration ends and the emergency period is over, we just like don't deal with endemic disease anywhere else. You've got vulnerable communities that are more affected in pandemic conditions. You've got companies and countries that are justifiably hesitant to like hand over all their stuff, you know, at significantly less than cost price. So we've got, you know, very predictable stuff going on. I think the treaty, I've been talking so much. I'm so sorry I haven't let you butt in at all.
No, that's the goal. That's the goal.
That's the goal. Okay. Well, I think what's good about this agreement is that it really, if these provisions stay in the draft as designed at the moment, it will really try and plug the gaps that even the amended IHR doesn't fill in pandemic response. And this starts, you know, way at the beginning of the story of an unfolding pandemic. You know, pandemics don't, you know, they don't fall out of a coconut tree, right? They are predicted by a set of upstream drivers, things like, you know, wildlife trade, like climate change, like deforestation. All of these things create a ripe environment for the spillover of zoonotic diseases with the potential to start pandemics in people. So they've got a bunch of provisions in there about, you know, conducting what's called like One Health surveillance, which is surveillance across, you know, human, animal, and environmental interactions. And then further down the track, you've got all these response provisions, which is things like making sure there's stuff like R&D diversification. So we've got, you know, local manufacturing capacities for things like vaccines, tests, and treatments, so you don't have that reliance. Provisions on tech transfer. The kind of make or break part of the treaty is a new system of pathogen access and benefit sharing, which is essentially a mechanism where countries will upload pathogen information to a sort of multilateral mechanism, database, what have you. And then that information will be shared with manufacturers who would then give back about 20%, 10% at donation, 10% at cost price to WHO, then to distribute it. So we've got this multilateral ecosystem here where there's more information about pathogens in circulations, which manufacturers can just nab, build stuff, and share equitably. So we don't have, you know, this really uneven distribution of tools to deal with pandemics. And the last kind of big critical thing is it's got some governance systems built in. So a conference of the parties is envisaged within this agreement, kind of like how the climate has, UNFCCC has a COP, like the climate COP. It would kind of be a little bit like that, where, you know, you'd have regular meetings of state parties to this agreement where they decide, you know, if they need more commitments under this thing, financing, problems with implementation, that kind of thing. So I think that all of the health emergencies we've seen over the last, you know, more than 5 years, but particularly over the last 5 years, is just screaming out for an agreement like this.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack in everything that you just said. So let's see if we can do at least some of it justice. And you know, one of the themes that we've talked about on the podcast here is about how, as you know, different biotech and mRNA technology in particular diffuses and gets cheaper. I mean, there's a scary aspect of that, to which, you know, somebody in their garage can be making a pathogen that's really disturbing or mutate something in a way that is terrible. But also, like, it should drive down the cost of creating vaccines and creating countermeasures for these things. So, I mean, that's a theme that we've come back to on the podcast, and it's interesting to think about that in the terms of at least simplifying one of the actors that you're talking about here, because some of these manufacturers, as this technology diffuses, well, they can either choose to get their costs here, or probably somebody's going to figure out how to do it themselves once the technology diffuses. But I think you also put your finger on the pulse of the issue here, which is, you mentioned China not being forthcoming on COVID-19 data, and it wasn't. And I'm not here to defend that, listeners. I want to repeat that again. I'm not here to defend that. But there was context to that, because China had an African swine fever epidemic that did not affect their human population, but affected their pig population really significantly in 2019 and 2020. And they asked for help with that, because pork is one of the major protein sources in China. And when they asked for help from the United States with that, the Trump administration said, great, we are now going to put in the phase 1 trade deal that you have to buy X amount of pork from U.S. farmers. So it was used against China as a point of leverage in a really serious way. And so the phase 1 trade deal is closing negotiations right around the time that stuff is beginning in Wuhan. And so I think you can understand why China was reticent to share information about something related to public health, because they had just seen how the United States was willing to use that against them in the context of an active trade negotiation. It does not absolve them, but I do think that is part of that. And the flip side of that is, I haven't looked closely at how the United States government has reacted to some of these things that you're talking about. But my guess is that the United States will talk a big game, but then when it comes down to actual ratification, will, run for the first exit. I'm thinking in particular of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, which the United States was part of the negotiations. And then when it came time to ratify, the U.S. government, the Senate in particular, said, nah, we're not going to ratify that. We are not going to be subject to external organizations being able to impose costs on the United States government, or force the United States governments to do things, which again sort of gets me back to one of the questions that we started with, which is, let's say the best case scenario happens. Let's say they get through the treaty negotiations. We have the updated IHR, and we have the new treaty, and everything is set in place. And let's say another pandemic starts again in Wuhan, China. Who is forcing China to share the information that they have agreed to share? Is anyone forcing them? Are there any mechanisms to actually force? Or let's not even make it Wuhan. Let's say it's Fayetteville, Arkansas, or something like that. Who forces the United States government to share that data with China and with and Russia and other countries that maybe it doesn't want to share that information with? Is there any mechanism, or is it really just, hey, the top level governments are agreeing and we're saying this is a good idea, but when the pandemic starts, or when the disease starts and everybody is afraid, it'll be like what you talked about, which is WHO Director General says one thing and all the other countries are like, great, we're going to do the exact opposite because we're completely freaked out and we don't care about what's on paper.
Yeah. I think you've touched on a problem that is pretty consistent across international law generally, because countries make international law, right? Very few countries are reticent to create a system of sanctions that they themselves might be impacted by one day. So the word force X country to do something just is not a word that really gets around in international law. So it's basically just soft pressure, and that's how these instruments have worked all the time, even in the negotiations for the international health regulations. So I will sidebar, the handy thing about the IHR is that they automatically come into effect for member states unless they specifically, New York noises, unless they specifically opt out of them. It's just a funny mechanism in the WHO constitution that countries agreed to a while ago. So the US, unless it specifically opts out of this set of amendments, which I don't think it has done yet, it'll automatically roll in a little over a year's time when the Director General says, yes, these are taking effect. So, but even in the negotiation of those, we were looking at, different compliance and accountability mechanisms that could go into there. And what they landed on was this implementation committee, which uses specific language like, we're not adversarial, like we're non-putative, we're just here to help. So that's the vibe of compliance that is in this treaty that already has 196 parties and presumably will have 196 parties going forward. The pandemic agreement currently doesn't have very strong accountability mechanisms in it whatsoever. I think every time the notion of sanctions gets proposed by, global health scholars or, even states parties, it gets knocked back pretty quickly, because the problem I said before is that, these countries are making these agreements. So it's not a matter of forcing it was an Arkansas or Wuhan to like hand over a bunch of data. And I think, health commissions in both America and China would be reticent to do that for the reasons you listed before. Like it's politically a little dangerous unless there are protections in the international framework that say like there are, there's a dispute mechanism or dispute resolution mechanism or something like that, or very stern remarks from the WHO saying like, you can't do this because the whole purpose is widely sharing information. So I think that's why there's been a bit of an effort to, tighten the timeframes for all of this. But really the consequences at the end of the day are in the court of public opinion. We don't even have in either of these treaties a regime that looks a little bit more like something that goes on in the human rights regime, which is a universal periodic review process where states kind of name and shame each other and say like human rights abuses are going on in your country, that kind of process was floated but hasn't been adopted in either of these instruments. So consequences for non-compliance are few and far between, but I think the consequence is the pandemic, right? And the COVID pandemic in particular, there's some estimates that says it's going to cost and I've got to fact check this, but like $13 trillion or like some stupid amount of money it cost the global economy. So many lives were lost, lives were upended. People have a real fear of diseases and people have a big mistrust of governments because of this thing. Like nobody wants to go through a pandemic again. So I think the consequences of, at least this is potentially optimistic, but I think that the consequences for not reporting information, at least with a disease that is behaving a bit like COVID-19, are eventually going to be worse. Not as bad as the consequences of an actual pandemic if this thing is left to, run rampant.
Maybe the example of COVID will help, but for me, one of the most depressing things about COVID was that, a disease that did not care about what nationality someone was, that crossed national borders at will, like it caused very serious competition between states. It wasn't like in the movies when the aliens come and all of the world joins together to fight the aliens. It was no, China's going to hoard PPE and the US is going to hoard vaccines and Africa is not going to get anything. So maybe we'll learn from that lesson in general. I haven't dived deep here, but I mean, just a couple things that I saw before we started recording, which is there is a bill in the Senate, which has currently been referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations, that says the Senate is supposed to be able to sign off on anything relating to the WHO that is a treaty. And there's also, apparently in August, there was another bill sort of introduced by Republican senators, the Defending American Sovereignty in Global Pandemics Act, which again, I'm going to quote here from the Republican senator from Wyoming, John Barrasso. The WHO's mishandling of the COVID pandemic was inexcusable. Their blatant partisanship and incompetence inflicted lasting harm on our country's health and economy. We cannot grant the WHO the authority to spend American tax dollars on another failed pandemic response. And there's also a letter to Biden urging him to withdraw the U.S. support from two international agreements that are supposed to strengthen WHO powers to declare public health emergencies. So those aren't passed yet, but you can tell it's in the political ether out there, especially coming from the Republican side, which is there is that reflexive thing in the U.S. government where they don't want external interference. And I mean, you're right that it goes back to that age-old question about international law. And it really struck me when you were talking about South Africa and some of these African states, because most of the dictators that have been held up in the International Criminal Court, I can't remember if Milosevic was in the ICC or whether that was a European context, but they're all African leaders who can't defend themselves, right? It's not like it's not like Henry Kissinger was ever going to be taken to the ICC, despite the fact that pretty good record for like some war crimes there.
So. Well, I think that the pushback to your point earlier, the pushback against pandemic agreement, a stronger IHR is pretty consistent within just populist politics around the world. There was the party formerly known as UKIP, I think it's called Reform UK now. Yep. Bolsonaro's government in Brazil. There was, and even populist tiny factions in Australia, if they get any oxygen at all, are pretty opposed to this kind of thing. But that is multilateralism. Generally, I think the pandemic was just a pretty potent example of, this amorphous body that's, in some people's view, trying to control people. But, WHO really doesn't have any of this power, and like nothing in the pandemic agreement would give it the power to do things that, people who are protecting or people who are advocating for protections of sovereignty above or else, there are reasonable limits to that. Like, nowhere in the pandemic agreement is the WHO given the power to implement a lockdown in another country. Because like I said before, these things are being negotiated by member states. Member states wouldn't put anything they don't want in there. And they don't have the power to implement vaccine mandates, they don't have the power to strip vaccine supplies away from countries. Like, none of this is really, really happened. So it's a delicate balance between rejecting sort of misinformation about, what parts of state sovereignty are actually being adjusted when negotiating these agreements. So I think the strongest you get is requirements to provide information is probably the strongest sort of chipping away at sovereignty that's in reality actually occurring.
We'll close out on a question that is impossible to answer, which is beyond your expertise and is beyond my expertise and is probably beyond anyone's expertise. I don't think there's an expert in the question that I'm about to ask you, which is a lot of this goes down, I think you were right to say, about trust and legitimacy of institutions. And that you can sort of see from that senator that I just quoted from, or from populist politicians, that there's a reflexive lack of trust in the WHO and in the IHR and in government's abilities to manage pandemics and things like that. And they can agree to all the treaties that they want in the world. If people don't trust those organizations and then don't change their behaviors when something happens because they trust those organizations, like a lot of ink was spilled for sort of no reason. So what do you think has to happen for countries or governments to look at what the WHO is saying or look at these treaties and say, no, we need to imbue this with legitimacy. There has to be an external observer that can tell us something that we actually trust, rather than just going down this never-ending, whether it's vaccines or do shutdowns work or everything else, sort of where we went with COVID. Is there any way to do that in your view?
Big question. I think with anything, building trust starts right at the community level, and it starts, before pandemics emerge, and it continues between pandemics. So I think in the context of a health emergency, the people who were, the most trusted to give reliable information about, vaccine efficacy and stuff like that were not, CDC. It wasn't, Dr. Fauci. It was, somebody's religious leader. It was somebody's barber. It was a trusted member of their community and their family. So the process of, fighting disinformation, it starts really at the community level, but it can be supported, by the higher ups, just making investments in, really sensible community conversations about the value of certain policies. You're right to touch on it as the big issue. There was a study, I think in the Lancet a while ago, that looked at all of the indicators under the IHR of how well countries would have fared in a pandemic context. And the biggest determinant of how well a country would do was not included on the list, which was two types of trust. It was trust in institutions, in scientific institutions and things like WHO, but also just interpersonal trust. How much did people trust their neighbor to do the right thing? And so that's a really hard thing to address. But my sense is you start with really trusted community advisors. You engage with people who have, respect within their communities to start delivering accurate information, not just about how a health emergency is developing, but particularly in that case because information can change so quickly. But the longer term project of building trust in institutions is a really, really tough one. It's in, designing curriculums. It's in supporting communities with the right information. It's about having honest conversations with your parents and, your uncles and stuff. So it's a challenge, but it's a really important one. And it is my hope that, in future national preparedness plans for health emergencies, building trust, engaging trusted community members is an indicator, if not, the top indicator is how we approach these things in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think I read, correct me if I'm wrong about this. I'm pretty sure I read this in one of your articles that, the IHR has passed, but it's not technically in effect yet. And we do have Mpox now as a national emergency and everything else. So to connect to that question, do you think that the response to Mpox will help build a little bit of that trust? Do you think that we have some legal frameworks in place to respond to Mpox in a way that might rehabilitate a little bit of the WHO's reputation? Do you think we'll be able to manage Mpox better because of the things that have been put in place, or do you think it will go the opposite direction?
So yeah, we technically don't have those legal frameworks in place just yet. But, one of the big changes with the IHR amendments was the inclusion of two overarching principles in the response, which, you don't need a binding treaty to say that these things are important. They were equity and solidarity. And I think these, as big principles, they've guided the article that we wrote in the New England Journal. But, you don't need a binding treaty to implement those kinds of principles. I think the Mpox outbreak is both an opportunity to test countries' resolve to actually act in solidarity and to act equitably. And I think, I'm an eternal optimist, but I think some of the actions to pledge, the coordination between WHO and Africa CDC are all generally good things. So far, we haven't seen, the kind of travel bans and that kind of thing happen around the world, which would suggest that people are kind of listening, even though these regulations, the revised regulations, haven't come into effect yet. But at the same time, it could be another real test, particularly of the commitment to equity. If the immediate emergency phase ends with the delivery of just enough vaccine to stop it seeding into countries like Thailand and Sweden, the test of the international community is like, do we care now? Do we care that there are, ongoing endemic outbreaks of this disease on the African continent? Are we going to invest in, things like vaccines, new treatments, new testing kits to actually stop outbreaks where they occur before they end up in high-income countries? So that, I think, that's kind of a thing I would like to see play out with more solidarity, with more equity. But like I mentioned before, I'm a bit of an optimist. So.
I'm also an eternal optimist, and I find that usually it's my job on the podcast to be a foil to the guests' pessimism. So I'm usually optimistic. So it's actually refreshing for me to get somebody who's even more optimistic than I am, and I'm having to foil pessimistically. So Alex, thanks so much for taking the time. And unfortunately, I think that we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk in the future if I haven't scared you off completely.
Not at all. But yeah, no, let's chat again. This is great.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.